Mark Lewis sat in the cramped office of the Midwest Observer, nervously tapping his pen against the edge of his notepad. For months, he'd been grinding away at fluff pieces, feel-good stories about local bake sales, interviews with small-town politicians, and even a piece on the county's largest pumpkin. It wasn't the hard-hitting journalism he'd envisioned when he joined the paper fresh out of college. That morning, however, his editor, Amanda Harper, had called him into her office with a promise: "I've got something big for you. Be ready." And now she stood before him, clutching a thin manila folder. "All right, Lewis," Amanda said, tossing the folder onto his desk. "This is it. Your shot at something real. Don't blow it." Mark grabbed the folder eagerly, flipping it open. Inside were sparse but unsettling details, 5 names, each accompanied by grainy photos and scant information about their last known whereabouts. His brow furrowed as he read the headline at the top of the page: "Farm workers vanish without a trace in rural Iowa." "Missing persons?" he asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. "Not just missing persons," Amanda replied, crossing her arms. "Migrant farm workers. 5 in total, all gone within the past 6 months. No bodies, no leads, no witnesses. What's worse, the cops don't seem to care. It's like they've just written it off." Mark flipped to a page with a map of rural Iowa. The disappearances were scattered across several counties, but one name kept coming up: Nathaniel Owens. "Who's this guy?" Mark asked, pointing at the name. Amanda leaned against his desk, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Nathaniel Owens. Local farmer, owns about 100 acres of land. 3 of the 5 missing workers were last seen on his property. But here's the kicker: Owens has a spotless reputation. He's a regular at town meetings, donates to local charities, even sponsors the high school football team. People in that community think he walks on water." Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. "And you think he's involved?" Amanda shrugged. "That's for you to find out. But I'm telling you, something's off. You don't just lose 5 people without leaving a trace." Mark glanced at the map again, noting the remoteness of the farms. "So, you're sending me to the middle of nowhere to investigate this? What if it's nothing?" Amanda smirked. "Then you'll come back with a nice story about small-town Iowa. But if it's something, well, you might just find yourself on the front page." Mark sighed, but the challenge sparked something in him. This was the kind of assignment he'd been waiting for, something with teeth. Later that evening, as he packed his suitcase, Amanda's parting words echoed in his mind: "Keep your wits about you, Mark. People don't just disappear out there. If there's a reason for this, you'll find it, but don't let it find you first." Her words stayed with him as he loaded his car and set off toward the lonely roads of Iowa, the glow of city lights fading into the distance behind him. The hum of the car engine was the only sound keeping Mark company as he drove deeper into the Midwest countryside. The further he went, the more the scenery became a monotonous blur: endless cornfields stretching to the horizon, their stalks swaying gently in the wind like silent sentinels. The paved highway eventually gave way to gravel roads, and the occasional farmhouse became rarer with each passing mile. Mark reached for his phone to check the time, but the screen displayed a grim reminder: no service. He tossed it onto the passenger seat with a sigh and glanced at the paper map Amanda had shoved into his hands before he left. Nate Owens' farm was circled in bright red ink, but it still seemed maddeningly far away. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long, golden shadows over the fields. For a moment, the beauty of it caught Mark off guard. He rolled down the window, letting the warm breeze sweep into the car, carrying with it the earthy scent of soil and crops. Despite the peace of the surroundings, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. Maybe it was the isolation, or Amanda's warning that people didn't just disappear for no reason out here. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched longer, and Mark began to notice small oddities on the roadside. A rusted scarecrow dressed in tattered overalls stood eerily still in the middle of a field, its straw head tilted at an unnatural angle. A barn with its roof caved in leaned precariously to one side, its windows shattered and dark. A rotting deer carcass lay in the ditch, swarmed by flies. Mark shook his head. Rural America in all its glory, he muttered. He adjusted his rearview mirror and froze. Headlights. A black truck had appeared behind him, its grille large and imposing. The truck maintained a steady distance, matching his speed. Mark tried to ignore it, chalking it up to another farmer on the road. But after 10 minutes of the same pattern, unease prickled at the back of his neck. He pressed the gas pedal slightly, increasing his speed. The truck did the same. Mark swallowed hard, glancing at the map again. He was still miles away from Nate Owens' farm. A jolt of panic surged through him as he realized just how alone he was out here. No service, no nearby towns, no one to call for help. The road curved sharply, and Mark made a sudden turn onto a gravel path leading into the cornfields. The truck stopped following, its headlights fading into the distance. He pulled over, heart pounding, and took a deep breath. When he finally arrived at the Owens farm, the black truck was nowhere to be seen, but the unease lingered, settling over him like a second shadow. The gravel crunched beneath Mark's tires as he pulled up to the Owens farm. The place was an island of civilization in a sea of endless cornfields. A weathered two-story farmhouse stood at the center, its white paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. To the left, a massive red barn loomed, its doors slightly ajar. A rusty windmill creaked in the breeze, punctuating the unsettling silence that blanketed the area. Mark killed the engine and sat for a moment, taking it all in. Something about the place felt off. It wasn't just the isolation, Mark had expected that, it was the feeling that the farm had been abandoned and yet wasn't. The fields were well tended, and there were signs of activity, tools scattered near the barn, a tractor parked nearby, and a faint plume of smoke rising from a fire pit behind the house. He grabbed his notebook and stepped out of the car, his boots sinking slightly into the loose gravel. The air smelled of freshly tilled earth, mixed with something metallic he couldn't quite place. "Can I help you?" The voice startled Mark, and he turned to see a man stepping out from the barn. Nathaniel Owens was tall and wiry, with deeply tanned skin that spoke of years under the sun. His hair was cropped short, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to size Mark up in a single glance. He wore a faded plaid shirt and jeans, his boots caked with dirt. "Nate Owens?" Mark asked, trying to sound confident despite the knot forming in his stomach. "That's right," Nate said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You the reporter?" Mark nodded, extending a hand. "Mark Lewis, with the Midwest Observer. Thanks for agreeing to talk with me." Nate hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. His grip was strong, almost too firm. "Didn't really have much of a choice, did I?" Nate said with a thin smile. "You folks in the media don't let things go." Mark chuckled nervously. "Well, I'm just here to understand the situation. A lot of people are worried about these disappearances." Nate's smile faded. "So they sent you all the way out here for that, huh?" "I already told the police everything I know. Those boys worked for me for a while, sure, but they left. Happens all the time. Migrant workers come and go. Nothing unusual about it." Mark pulled out his notepad, jotting down a few notes. "I understand that, but 3 of the missing workers were last seen here on your farm. That's a pretty strong connection." Nate's expression darkened. He leaned slightly closer, and Mark caught a whiff of sweat and motor oil. "You accusing me of something?" Nate asked, his voice low and even. Mark raised his hands defensively. "Not at all. Just trying to get the facts straight. People are asking questions, and I'm here to get answers. Maybe clear your name." Nate stared at him for a long moment, then let out a humorless laugh. Clear my name, huh? Alright, city boy, you want to look around, ask questions, whatever, go ahead. I've got nothing to hide. Mark forced a smile, but the tension in the air was palpable. Nate gestured toward the barn. You can start in there if you want. Tools, equipment, stuff the workers used. Just don't get in my way. Mark nodded, slipping his notebook back into his pocket. As he headed toward the barn, he couldn't shake the feeling that Nate was watching him, closely. Inside the barn, the air was heavy with the scent of hay and something else, faint but unmistakable, the sour stench of decay. Mark scanned the space, noting the neatly arranged tools, the stacks of hay bales, and the rows of feed barrels. But something felt wrong. A sudden creak of floorboards above him made Mark freeze. He glanced up at the rafters, but there was nothing there, just shadows. When he turned back toward the door, Nate was standing there, arms crossed, his eyes sharp and unblinking. You find what you're looking for? Nate asked. Mark forced a grin. Just getting started. But as he stepped out into the fading light, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Something about Nate Owens, and his farm, didn't add up. Mark sat in his car for a moment, scribbling in his notepad while glancing occasionally at the barn and farmhouse. Nate Owens had retreated inside after their brief conversation, leaving Mark to explore the property on his own. Though Nate had been cooperative, on the surface, at least, there was an undercurrent of hostility that made Mark's skin crawl. The way Nate watched him, the way his words carried a faint edge, hinted at something he wasn't saying. Mark decided to start with the surrounding property. The barn had felt too claustrophobic, and he wasn't ready to step inside again just yet. The open air gave him a false sense of security as he wandered toward the edge of the fields. Rows of corn stretched endlessly into the horizon, their stalks whispering faintly in the wind. Mark ducked beneath the overhang of a silo, its metal frame rusted and riddled with dents. He noticed a small shed nearby, its paint peeling and roof sagging under years of neglect. The door was unlocked, and Mark hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the space was dim and cluttered with tools, spare parts, and broken equipment. He flipped on his flashlight, sweeping it across the interior. His beam landed on something unusual, an old wooden crate in the corner, partially hidden beneath a tarp. Mark crouched down and pulled the tarp away, revealing the crate's lid nailed shut. He tried prying it open with his hands, but it wouldn't budge. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted a crowbar on a nearby workbench. With a grunt, he wedged it under the lid and forced it up. The lid popped open with a sharp crack, and Mark stepped back as the pungent smell of rot hit him like a wave. Inside were plastic-wrapped bundles of what appeared to be clothing, shirts, pants, boots. The items were stained with dark blotches that Mark immediately recognized as dried blood. His stomach churned as he picked up a shirt and saw the name, Miguel, embroidered on the pocket. He dropped the shirt as though it had burned him. Miguel Ruiz was one of the missing workers listed in Amanda's file. Mark stepped out of the shed, gasping for fresh air as he tried to calm the panic rising in his chest. This wasn't just a lead, it was evidence. But why would Nate keep something like this on his property? Was it a sick trophy? A mistake? Before Mark could think further, he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He turned sharply to see Nate standing there, his face impassive but his eyes burning with suspicion. Find anything interesting? Nate asked, his voice low and measured. Mark swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. Just poking around. Figured I'd check out the shed. Nate's gaze flicked toward the open door, his jaw tightening. I told you to stay out of the way. I thought you said you had nothing to hide, Mark shot back, hoping to mask his fear with confidence. Nate took a step closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Mark. Careful, city boy. You're a long way from home, and people out here don't take kindly to outsiders sticking their noses where they don't belong. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. He stammered out a quick apology and retreated toward his car, his heart pounding in his chest. As he climbed inside and started the engine, he glanced back at the shed. Nate was still standing there, watching him. Mark sped down the gravel road, desperate to put distance between himself and the farm. But the evidence he'd found weighed heavily on his mind. The bloody clothes were no coincidence, and he was now certain Nate Owens wasn't as innocent as he claimed. But if Nate knew Mark had seen the crate, what would he do to protect his secret? Mark's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, gravel spitting under his tires as he sped down the narrow road leading away from the Owens farm. His heart raced, every nerve in his body screaming at him to keep driving and not look back. But his thoughts wouldn't stop circling around what he had seen in that shed, the blood-stained clothes, the name embroidered on the shirt, and, most of all, the look in Nate Owens' eyes. "Think, Mark, think," he muttered under his breath. He needed a plan. What he had found was more than enough to blow this case wide open, but he couldn't just march into a police station with accusations and a gut feeling. Especially not when the local authorities seemed content to ignore the disappearances altogether. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, startling him. For a split second, he felt relief. It meant he was back in an area with service. He pulled over, his tires skidding slightly on the gravel, and grabbed the phone. It was Amanda. "Mark," she said as soon as he answered. "You okay? You sound out of breath." "I'm fine," Mark said, though his voice trembled. Amanda, I found something. I think it's big." "No, I know it's big. What did you find?" Amanda's voice sharpened. He hesitated, glancing at the road behind him. He half expected to see the black truck again, its headlights bearing down on him. "There's evidence," he said finally. "Clothes. They belonged to one of the missing workers, Miguel Ruiz. They were covered in blood. Amanda, I think Nate Owens knows exactly what happened to those people." There was a long pause on the other end. "Mark, you need to get out of there," Amanda said. "If this guy is dangerous, you can't confront him on your own. Get to a safe place and call the police. Let them handle it." Mark clenched his jaw. "The police? You really think they'll do anything? They've had 6 months to act, Amanda, and they've done nothing. What makes you think they'll care now?" "I don't care what you think of them, Mark," Amanda snapped. "Just get out of there and don't do anything stupid. You're no good to this story, or to me, if you end up missing too." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine. I'll figure something out." As he hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the fields in deep oranges and purples. The isolation that had felt merely eerie earlier now felt suffocating. He glanced at the road ahead, debating whether to find a motel or drive straight back to town. His gut told him to keep moving, but before he could make a decision, his headlights caught something on the side of the road. It was a scarecrow, or at least, it looked like one. Its body was made of old clothes stuffed with straw, and its head was a burlap sack with a crude face drawn on it in black ink. But what sent a chill down Mark's spine was its positioning. It wasn't standing in a field like the others he'd passed earlier. This one was sitting on the side of the road, propped against a fence post, as if it had been left there for him to see. Mark's foot hovered over the gas pedal, his instincts screaming at him to drive. But curiosity got the better of him. He stepped out of the car, keeping the engine running, and approached the scarecrow cautiously. As he drew closer, the details became clearer. The clothes weren't just old, they were filthy, stained with dirt and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. The burlap sack had been tied tightly around the neck with a length of frayed rope. And sticking out from the pocket of the scarecrow's jacket was a piece of paper. Mark hesitated, his breath shallow, before reaching for the paper. It was folded neatly, and when he opened it, his blood ran cold. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words. "Stop asking questions." Mark stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. He turned and bolted for his car, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he slammed the door shut and sped off, he couldn't help but feel that he'd just been given a warning, and he had no intention of ignoring it. But as he drove, a single question lingered in his mind: how had Nate Owens known where he'd be? By the time Mark pulled into the parking lot of a rundown roadside motel, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a dull, bruised purple. The neon vacancy sign flickered erratically, buzzing faintly in the silence. Mark's nerves were frayed. The image of the blood-stained clothes in Nate's shed, the crude scarecrow on the side of the road, and the warning note, it all played on a loop in his mind. The motel looked like the kind of place where bad things happened. The parking lot was empty except for a battered pickup truck, and the office's lone window was illuminated by a flickering fluorescent light. Mark killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. He had no choice but to stop for the night. His exhaustion was catching up with him, and he needed time to figure out his next move. Mark grabbed his bag and stepped out of the car, feeling the chill of the night air prickling his skin. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way to the office. Inside, the air was stale, and the room smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. A small, balding man sat behind the counter, his nose buried in a crossword puzzle. He didn't look up until Mark cleared his throat. "Need a room," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man eyed him suspiciously. "How long?" "Just for the night." The man grunted, pulling a key from a pegboard behind him and sliding it across the counter. "Room 8. Around the corner." Mark handed over a few crumpled bills, took the key, and forced a polite nod before heading back outside. Room 8 was on the far end of the motel, its door dented and the number barely hanging on by a single nail. Mark unlocked it and stepped inside, flipping the light switch. The room was as depressing as he'd expected: peeling wallpaper, a bed with an uneven mattress, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. He locked the door behind him and set his bag down on the table, collapsing onto the edge of the bed. For the first time since he'd left the farm, he let himself breathe. But the sense of relief was short-lived. Mark pulled out his notebook, flipping to the page where he'd written details about the shed. He needed to organize his thoughts. He had evidence now: the bloody clothes, the scarecrow, the note. But none of it explained what had happened to the workers or why Nate Owens seemed so intent on intimidating him. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound outside. A faint crunch of gravel. Mark froze, his pen hovering over the notebook. The noise came again, louder this time, like deliberate footsteps. He glanced at the window. The curtains were drawn, but the faint glow of the neon sign outside spilled through the edges. Slowly, Mark stood and approached the window. He pulled the curtain back slightly, just enough to peek outside. The parking lot was empty, save for his car and the old pickup truck he'd seen earlier. The gravel looked undisturbed. He let the curtain fall back into place, but the unease in his chest refused to go away. As he turned back to his notebook, there was a sharp knock on the door. Mark's breath hitched. He stared at the door, his mind racing. Who would be knocking at this hour? The knock came again, louder this time. "Who is it?" Mark called out, trying to keep his voice steady. Silence. Mark crept toward the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the peephole. He leaned in and peered through it, but the corridor outside was empty. His stomach churned. He backed away from the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, he saw it. On the floor just inside the door was a piece of paper, folded neatly in half. It hadn't been there before. Mark stared at it, his mind screaming at him not to pick it up. But curiosity won out. He crouched down and unfolded the paper, his hands trembling. 2 words were scrawled in the same shaky handwriting as the note on the scarecrow. Go home. Mark dropped the paper like it was on fire, his heart hammering in his chest. Who had left it? How had they knocked and disappeared so quickly? Mark sat down on the bed, staring at the note. His gut told him to leave, to get in his car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But something else, something stronger, told him he was closer to the truth than ever. For now, though, all he could do was lock the door, stay awake, and hope he made it through the night. The dim light in the motel room flickered slightly, casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, the note still on the floor in front of him. His mind was a whirlpool of fear and confusion. Whoever had left the note had been close, too close. He checked the door again, ensuring the lock and chain were secure. Then he grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and wedged it under the doorknob for extra security. It was a flimsy measure, but it gave him some peace of mind. The air in the room felt stifling, heavy with tension. Mark paced back and forth, glancing occasionally at the window. The curtains remained shut, but the faint glow of the neon sign seeped through, casting a sickly red hue on the floor. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside, sent his nerves into overdrive. He checked his phone. Still no service. The isolation weighed on him like a physical burden. He considered leaving, just grabbing his things and driving until he was somewhere safe, but the thought of going back out into the dark, empty roads terrified him even more. Mark sat back down at the table, flipping through his notes again in an attempt to distract himself. The names of the missing workers stared back at him: Miguel Ruiz, Jorge Pena, Eduardo Morales. All of them had been last seen on Nate Owens' farm. He underlined Miguel's name twice. The bloody shirt with Miguel's name embroidered on it was proof that something sinister had happened on that farm. And Nate's reaction when Mark had found the shed. There was no doubt in Mark's mind now that the farmer was hiding something. But what? And why would he go to such lengths to intimidate him? The knock at the door echoed in his mind. The note. The scarecrow. Mark rubbed his temples. He needed to think clearly, but exhaustion was creeping in, clouding his judgment. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the adrenaline that had fueled him earlier was wearing off. As he sat there, a faint noise broke through the silence. A scraping sound, like metal on metal. Mark froze, straining his ears to locate the source. It was coming from outside, near his car. He stood slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and approached the window. He moved the curtain aside just enough to see into the parking lot. At first, everything seemed normal. His car was parked where he had left it, the empty lot illuminated by the flickering neon sign. But then he saw movement. A figure crouched near the back of his car, partially obscured by shadows. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The person was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be fiddling with something on the rear bumper. Mark's mind raced. Should he confront them? Call for help? But his phone was useless, and the nearest town was miles away. He reached for the flashlight in his bag, gripping it tightly as he moved to the door. He slowly unlocked the chain and eased the door open just enough to peer out. The cool night air hit his face as he crept outside, keeping to the shadows. The figure didn't notice him at first, too focused on whatever they were doing. Mark could see now that they were holding a knife, using it to carve something into the paint of his car. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his voice trembling but loud enough to startle the person. The figure jerked upright, their face obscured by a hood. For a split second, they hesitated, and then they bolted, disappearing into the darkness behind the motel. Mark stood frozen, his flashlight beam shaking in his hand. He thought about chasing them but quickly decided against it. He wasn't prepared to confront someone who might be armed. Instead, he turned his attention to his car. The rear bumper was scratched and dented, but it was what was carved into the paint that sent a chill down his spine. Leave. Mark stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Whoever had left the note and knocked on his door had escalated. They weren't just trying to scare him anymore, they wanted him gone. He hurried back to his room, locking the door and pushing the chair back under the knob. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his notebook and wrote down everything that had just happened. As he sat there, adrenaline surging through his veins, he realized something important. Whoever was behind this wasn't just protecting Nate Owens, they were watching him. And they were willing to do whatever it took to make him stop asking questions. Mark stayed awake for the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, waiting for the dawn to break. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot, painting the cracked asphalt in soft gold. Mark sat by the window, his eyes heavy but unblinking. He hadn't slept. Every noise throughout the night, every creak of the building, every gust of wind, had kept him on edge. The flashlight in his hand had become a makeshift weapon, though he knew it wouldn't do much good if someone truly wanted to get to him. When the morning came, it brought no relief. If anything, the sight of his car in the daylight made the events of the night feel even more real. The word "leave" was still gouged into the paint of his bumper, and the thought of someone crouching there in the darkness sent a fresh wave of unease through him. Mark threw his things into his bag and headed to the office to check out. The motel clerk from the night before barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Rough night?" the clerk asked, his tone disinterested. Mark hesitated. For a moment, he considered telling the man what had happened, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the clerk's indifference, or maybe it was the gnawing feeling that this was bigger than a bad night at a motel. "Yeah, something like that," Mark muttered, sliding the room key across the counter. He stepped outside and took a deep breath of the cool morning air. His first instinct was to get back in his car and drive as far away as possible. But as he looked at the scratches on the bumper, his fear began to harden into something else, determination. Someone was trying to scare him off. That much was clear. But why? What were they protecting? Mark grabbed his notebook from the passenger seat and flipped to the page where he'd jotted down details about the farm. He had already uncovered enough to know that Nate Owens wasn't as innocent as he seemed. The bloody clothes, the scarecrow, the note, everything pointed to the farm as the center of whatever was happening in this rural stretch of Iowa. But Nate wasn't acting alone. That much was clear after last night. Someone else had followed him, someone willing to leave threats and vandalize his car to keep him quiet. Mark decided he needed more evidence, something undeniable, something that would force the authorities to take this seriously. He couldn't rely on the local police, he needed to dig deeper himself. Back to the farm. As Mark drove back toward the Owens farm, he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Going back was risky. If Nate or whoever else was involved realized he wasn't going to back down, they might escalate. But the journalist in him couldn't let it go. The gravel road leading to the farm seemed even more desolate in the daylight. The endless cornfields swayed gently in the breeze, their stalks whispering secrets Mark couldn't hear. He pulled his car off the road a mile before the farm and parked behind a cluster of trees. If Nate saw him coming, he might not get the chance to investigate further. Mark grabbed his bag and began walking, sticking to the edge of the fields to stay out of sight. The morning sun was warm on his back, but his stomach churned with anxiety. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. When he reached the edge of the property, he crouched behind a cluster of bushes, scanning the area. The farmhouse and barn looked the same as the day before, but now there was a tractor idling near the barn, and Mark could hear faint voices. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like two people arguing. He moved closer, keeping low. The voices grew louder as he approached the barn. "I told you he's not going to stop," one voice said, sharp and angry. "And I told you to leave it to me," another voice replied, deeper and calm. Mark recognized it immediately. It was Nate. Mark crept closer, peering through a crack in the barn door. Inside, Nate was standing with another man, shorter and stockier, wearing a black hoodie. The man's face was partially obscured by shadows, but Mark recognized the hoodie as the same one worn by the figure who had vandalized his car the night before. "You've already drawn too much attention," Nate said, his voice low but firm. "You want more people sniffing around here?" The man in the hoodie spat on the ground. "We should have handled him last night." "You're too soft, Nate." Mark's blood turned to ice. They were talking about him. Nate stepped closer to the man, his posture tense. "Listen to me. We've been careful for years. I'm not letting some reporter ruin everything because you don't know how to keep a cool head. Now go check the fields. Make sure everything's clean." The man muttered something under his breath but eventually stalked off, disappearing into the cornfields. Mark's heart raced. He needed to leave, now. But as he turned to retreat, his foot caught on a loose plank, and the wood creaked loudly. Inside the barn, Nate froze. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice sharp. Mark didn't wait to find out if Nate would investigate. He bolted, weaving through the cornfields as fast as his legs could carry him. The stalks scratched at his arms and face, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, he heard Nate's voice shouting, "Hey! Get back here!" Mark didn't look back. All he could do was run. Mark's lungs burned as he sprinted through the dense cornfields, his heart pounding louder than his footfalls. The tall stalks slapped against his arms and face, leaving small cuts, but he didn't dare slow down. Behind him, Nate's shouts grew louder, closer. "Stop!" Nate bellowed. "You don't know what you're getting into." The words made Mark's stomach churn. Whatever Nate was hiding, it was big enough to make him desperate, and desperation was dangerous. Mark pushed forward, the uneven ground threatening to trip him with every step. He glanced back for a split second and saw movement in the rows of corn. Nate was chasing him, a large silhouette tearing through the field with surprising speed. Fear fueled Mark's legs as he changed direction abruptly, cutting left and hoping to lose Nate in the maze of stalks. He ducked low, trying to quiet his movements, but the rustling of the corn betrayed him. "You think you're smart, huh?" Nate's voice boomed. "I know these fields better than you ever will. There's no way out for you, boy." Mark gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. If he could just make it back to the road, he might have a chance. His car was parked about a mile away, he just needed to reach it. Ahead of him, the cornfield broke into a small clearing, a patch of bare dirt surrounded by stalks. Mark stumbled into it, gasping for air. His eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but before he could move, he heard the distinct crunch of boots behind him. He turned, and there was Nate, stepping into the clearing with a scowl etched deep into his weathered face. He held a pitchfork in his hand, its rusted tines glinting faintly in the morning light. "You should have left when you had the chance," Nate growled, his voice calm but menacing. Mark's mind raced. His body screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Nate had him cornered. "I'm just doing my job," Mark said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "You don't have to do this. We can talk." Nate shook his head, taking a slow step forward. "Talking's what got us here in the first place. You people don't know when to mind your own business." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. He took a step back, but his foot hit something solid. Glancing down, he saw an old, rusted trap lying in the dirt, a relic of the farm's past. An idea sparked in his mind, desperate and reckless. "Look, I get it," Mark said, keeping his voice steady as he subtly nudged the trap with his foot, sliding it closer to him. "You're trying to protect your farm, your reputation. But killing me isn't going to make this go away. People will come looking for me." Nate let out a humorless laugh. "People like you don't get missed, son. You're just another nosy outsider who doesn't know when to quit." Mark's fingers brushed against the lever of the trap, and he realized he only had one shot. Nate was now just a few steps away, the pitchfork raised slightly. "I'm not quitting," Mark said, his voice defiant. With that, he grabbed the trap and hurled it at Nate's feet. The sudden movement startled the farmer, and as the rusted metal clanged against the ground, Nate stumbled back, his boot landing squarely in the open jaws of the trap. There was a sickening snap as the trap's teeth clamped shut around his ankle. Nate roared in pain, dropping the pitchfork as he fell to one knee. Mark didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned and bolted, sprinting back into the cornfield with everything he had left. Nate's curses and cries echoed behind him, but Mark didn't look back. This time, he didn't stop until he broke free of the cornfield and reached the gravel road. His car was just ahead, hidden behind the trees where he'd left it. Mark fumbled with his keys as he ran, his hands trembling. When he finally reached the car, he threw open the door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, and he tore down the road, the gravel kicking up in his wake. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The cornfield stood still, silent and unyielding, as though it had swallowed Nate whole. Mark's chest heaved as he gripped the wheel, his mind racing. He had narrowly escaped, but the danger wasn't over. He needed to figure out his next move, before Nate, or whoever else was involved, caught up to him. Mark drove aimlessly for miles, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The adrenaline from his escape hadn't faded, and his thoughts raced as fast as the car down the desolate Iowa backroads. The farther he got from the Owens farm, the safer he felt, but safety wasn't enough. He needed answers. He pulled over near a rusted, abandoned gas station, the kind of place where the pumps looked like relics from the 1950s. The lot was overgrown with weeds, and the cracked asphalt glimmered faintly in the midday sun. Mark parked his car behind the building, out of sight from the road, and sat for a moment, collecting himself. He opened his notebook, flipping through the pages of scribbled notes. Nate Owens wasn't working alone, that much was obvious. The man in the hoodie, the scarecrow, the threats, they pointed to a larger, coordinated effort to keep something buried. But what? Mark's mind drifted to the crate he had found in the shed, the bloody clothes that tied Nate to the missing workers. The farm wasn't just a crime scene, it was the epicenter of something far worse. He knew what he had to do. The evidence he already had wouldn't be enough to break the case wide open. He needed to go deeper, to uncover the full extent of what Nate Owens was hiding. But Mark also knew he couldn't do it alone. He rummaged through his bag, pulling out his laptop and a portable Wi-Fi hotspot. To his relief, the hotspot connected, though the signal was weak. He opened a secure browser and began digging into anything he could find about Nate Owens and the surrounding area. The missing workers. Mark started with the missing workers, combing through old news articles and police reports. Most of the coverage was sparse, relegated to small blurbs in local papers. But as he pieced together the timeline, a pattern emerged. All 5 workers had disappeared after working at farms within a 50-mile radius of the Owens property. Each had been undocumented, with no local family to report them missing. 3 of the disappearances were linked directly to Nate's farm, but the other 2. Mark's fingers paused over the keyboard as a new thought struck him. The other 2 workers had last been seen at farms owned by people who were close friends of Nate Owens, names that had come up during his initial research. One was a neighbor who lived just a few miles away, and the other was the owner of a nearby grain silo. A chill ran down Mark's spine. This wasn't just about Nate. This was a network. Digging into Nate Owens. Mark shifted his focus to Nate himself, combing through public records. The farmer had lived in the area his whole life, inheriting the property from his father. He had a clean criminal record, but there were small red flags that started to add up. Nate had filed for bankruptcy twice in the last 15 years, despite the fact that his farm had always appeared profitable. He had also been involved in a quiet lawsuit with a former employee, a lawsuit that had been dropped under suspicious circumstances. The details were sealed, but Mark's instincts told him it was connected. And then he found it. A buried article from a local paper, dated 15 years ago. It detailed the death of a young man who had worked on the Owens farm, labeled as an accident. According to the report, the man had fallen into a grain silo and suffocated. The story had been dismissed as a tragic workplace mishap, but something about it didn't sit right with Mark. He leaned back in his seat, his heart pounding. There was a trail of deaths and disappearances connected to Nate Owens, stretching back years. And if the local authorities weren't investigating, it was because they either didn't care, or they were complicit. A desperate call. Mark hesitated before pulling out his phone. He didn't trust the local police, but there was one person he could trust, Amanda. He dialed her number, and she picked up on the second ring. "Mark," she said, her voice tense. "Where the hell are you? I've been trying to reach you all morning." "I'm fine," Mark said, though his voice wavered. "But Amanda, listen. This is bigger than I thought. It's not just Nate Owens. There's a whole network of people involved, farmers, workers, maybe even the police." Amanda exhaled sharply. "Mark, this is dangerous. You can't take this on by yourself." "I don't have a choice," Mark said. "I need more evidence. Enough to blow this open so no one can ignore it." "You're already in over your head," Amanda snapped. "Get out of there, now. Bring me what you've got, and we'll figure it out together." Mark hesitated, glancing at the cracked windshield of his car. He knew Amanda was right, but something in him refused to walk away. The thought of those missing workers, of their families never knowing the truth, was enough to keep him going. "I can't," Mark said finally. "Not yet." Amanda sighed. "At least tell me where you are." Mark gave her his location, promising to check in again soon. As he hung up, he felt a pang of guilt. If anything happened to him, Amanda would be the only one who knew where he'd been. He closed his laptop and started the car, his next move clear. He was going back to the Owens farm, this time, to find something that couldn't be ignored. Mark parked his car on the side of a dirt road a few miles from the Owens farm, hidden behind a cluster of trees. He left his phone in the glove compartment and grabbed only his notebook, flashlight, and a compact camera, the strap slung tightly around his neck. This time, he was going in with a plan, to find irrefutable evidence and get out before Nate, or anyone else, caught him. The sky was beginning to darken, the faint orange glow of the setting sun bleeding into deep purple. Mark moved quietly through the cornfields, retracing the path he had taken earlier when he had fled. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made his pulse quicken, but he kept going, driven by the weight of what he had uncovered. The barn loomed ahead, its shadow long and foreboding in the fading light. Mark crouched low, using the rows of corn as cover, and waited. He could hear distant voices coming from the house, Nate and someone else, though he couldn't make out their words. Mark used the opportunity to slip into the barn. The large wooden doors creaked slightly as he pushed one open just enough to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay, oil, and something sour that turned Mark's stomach. He turned on his flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the dim space. The barn looked as it had before, rows of tools neatly hung on the walls, barrels of feed stacked in one corner, and bales of hay piled high. But this time, Mark was determined to go deeper. The hidden door. Mark's eyes caught something he hadn't noticed during his earlier visit, a trapdoor partially hidden beneath a tarp in the far corner of the barn. His heart raced as he approached it, carefully pulling the tarp away. The trapdoor was old and wooden, with rusted hinges and a heavy padlock securing it. Mark knelt down, examining it closely. There were faint scratches around the edges of the wood, as if someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out. Mark's stomach churned. Whatever was down there, it wasn't meant to be found. He searched the barn for something to break the lock and found a crowbar leaning against the wall. His hands shook as he wedged the tool under the lock and applied pressure. The lock groaned in protest before snapping open with a sharp crack. Mark hesitated, gripping the edge of the trapdoor. For a moment, he considered turning back. But he knew he couldn't, not after everything he had seen. With a deep breath, he pulled the door open. The basement. A dark, narrow staircase descended into the earth, the air growing colder and damper with each step. Mark's flashlight illuminated the rough wooden walls, which were stained and scratched. The smell of decay grew stronger as he reached the bottom. The basement was a small, cramped space with a dirt floor and concrete walls. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, their ends bolted to the walls. Mark's flashlight swept across the room, revealing scattered tools, dirty rags, and a table covered in dark stains. His chest tightened as he realized what this place was, a holding area. In the far corner, Mark's flashlight caught something that made his blood run cold. A pile of discarded clothing lay crumpled on the floor, mixed with torn pieces of fabric and muddy boots. He moved closer, kneeling to examine the clothes. Some of the items had names embroidered on them: Jorge, Eduardo, Miguel. Mark pulled out his camera and began snapping pictures, his hands shaking as he documented the scene. He felt nauseous, but he forced himself to keep going. As he moved toward the table, he noticed a stack of papers pinned under a rusted wrench. He pulled them free and scanned the first page. It was a ledger, handwritten and detailed. Names, dates, and amounts of money were listed, along with a single word written repeatedly in the margins: sold. Mark's stomach dropped as the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a series of disappearances, it was human trafficking. Nate and his network were exploiting undocumented workers, selling them off to whoever would pay the right price. Mark snapped more photos of the ledger, knowing it was the key to exposing the operation. Footsteps above. As he finished taking pictures, a sudden noise froze him in place. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from the barn above. Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He turned off his flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness. His ears strained to hear more. The footsteps grew louder, closer. "Trapdoors open," a deep voice said. It wasn't Nate, this voice was rougher, angrier. Mark pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. He clutched the crowbar tightly, knowing he might need to defend himself. "Think he's down there?" the voice continued. There was no reply, but the creak of floorboards made it clear someone was approaching the stairs. Mark's mind raced. There was no way out of the basement except the stairs, and whoever was coming down wasn't going to let him leave without a fight. As the first boot hit the steps, Mark tightened his grip on the crowbar. He would have to make a move, and fast. Mark crouched in the darkness, the cold, damp air pressing against his skin as the sound of heavy boots echoed down the staircase. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it might give him away. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go, no escape except through whoever was coming down those stairs. The flashlight in his pocket felt heavy, but he didn't dare turn it on. Instead, he gripped the crowbar tighter, his hands slick with sweat. The boots reached the bottom step. "Come on out," the man said, his voice low and mocking. "I know you're down here. You think you can just walk onto Nate's farm, dig through our business, and get away with it?" Mark stayed silent, pressing himself further into the shadows. The man's flashlight clicked on, its beam slicing through the darkness and sweeping across the room. Mark's pulse quickened as the light passed dangerously close to his hiding spot. "You're just making this harder on yourself," the man muttered, stepping further into the basement. The beam landed on the pile of clothes in the corner. "Guess you found our little secret, huh?" Mark's mind raced. He needed a distraction, something to throw the man off. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use. Then he saw it, a rusted toolbox sitting on a low shelf a few feet away. Slowly, Mark reached out with the crowbar, hooking it around the edge of the toolbox. With a quick tug, he yanked it off the shelf. It crashed to the floor with a loud clatter, tools spilling across the dirt. The man whipped around, his flashlight darting toward the noise. "There you are," he snarled, moving toward the sound. Mark didn't hesitate. He sprang from his hiding spot, swinging the crowbar with everything he had. It connected with the man's arm, and he cried out in pain, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the room, plunging parts of it into darkness. Mark didn't wait for him to recover. He darted past the man, his adrenaline surging, and bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. "Get back here," the man roared, but Mark didn't stop. A race against time. Bursting into the barn, Mark's eyes struggled to adjust to the faint light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. He could hear the man scrambling up the stairs behind him, his curses growing louder. Mark sprinted toward the doors, shoving them open and stumbling into the open air. The cool night hit him like a slap to the face, but he didn't dare slow down. He made a beeline for the cornfields, knowing they were his best chance to lose his pursuer. The stalks closed around him as he plunged into the field, their dry leaves whipping against his arms and face. Behind him, he heard the man crash through the barn doors, his heavy footsteps following close behind. "You can't run forever," the man shouted. Mark didn't reply. His lungs burned as he pushed forward, weaving through the rows of corn in a desperate attempt to shake his pursuer. He knew the field was a maze, but he also knew he had to get to his car. He could hear the man crashing through the field, the sound of broken stalks growing louder. Mark's legs felt like they were on fire, but the thought of being caught kept him moving. Finally, he broke free of the cornfield, stumbling onto the dirt road where his car was hidden. The sight of it filled him with a surge of hope. He sprinted the last few yards, yanking open the door and diving inside. His hands fumbled with the keys, adrenaline making his movements clumsy. The roar of the engine was like music to his ears. Just as he threw the car into drive, the man burst out of the cornfield, his face twisted in rage. Mark didn't wait for him to get closer. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as the car shot forward. The evidence. Mark didn't stop driving until he was miles away, the Owens farm nothing but a distant memory in his rearview mirror. His hands still trembled as he clutched the wheel, his mind replaying everything he had seen in the basement. He pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, parking under the bright lights. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to exhale. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out his camera and scrolled through the photos he had taken. The ledger, the bloody clothes, the chains in the basement, it was all there. Undeniable evidence of the horrors taking place on the Owens farm. Mark pulled out his phone and dialed Amanda's number. "It's me," he said when she answered. "I got everything. Photos, documents, you name it. This is bigger than we thought, Amanda. It's a trafficking operation." Amanda's voice was sharp. "Mark, where are you? Are you safe?" "For now," Mark replied, glancing around the empty parking lot. "I'm heading back to the city. This story is going to blow the lid off everything." "You did good," Amanda said, her voice softening. "But don't take any chances. Get back here as soon as you can." Mark hung up and leaned back in his seat, the weight of the night finally settling on him. He had the evidence, the story, everything he needed to expose Nate Owens and his network. But as he started the car and pulled back onto the road, a thought lingered in the back of his mind: if they were willing to go this far to keep their secret, what would they do to stop him now? The headlights cut through the darkness as Mark drove into the night, the truth burning in his hands, and a target on his back.